Bonjour. Today we're talking about the French Revolution. So we're going to dive right in and talk about the society and the fiscal crisis that plagued France. We're going to start with Louis XVI. Now, Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette became king and queen of France in 1774. And before I get too far into this, there is something I want to say about these two is they were incredibly young to be ruling over an entire country. Louis XVI's grandfather was the king before his father actually died. So young Louis became next in line. He became Louis XVI shortly after his 18th birthday. So legally an adult, but probably not the most fit to rule. His wife, Marie Antoinette, was believe the second youngest of 13 children. She was incredibly spoiled. She found school boring, so she didn't learn to properly read and write until she was about 13 years old. And when you're going to be the ruler of a country and you have to examine important documents and make decisions, this can cause some issues. French society was divided into three estates. You have the first estate, which was the clergy, the second estate, the hereditary nobility, and the third estate, everyone else. The clergy and the nobility controlled vast amounts of wealth, probably about 90% of all land, and the clergy was actually exempt from nearly all taxes. The second estate, a number of them were exempt from the majority of taxes, paid some, but not a lot, much like the clergy. So you essentially have 10% of the population who owns land paying the majority of the taxes. The third estate included the rapidly wealthy middle class, the bourgeoisie, but again, everyone else. So while the bourgeoisie prosper, you have the peasants, who are 80% of the population. It's artisans, workers, and small shopkeepers who were suffering in the 1780s from a massive economic depression that was the result of poor harvests. Urban poverty and rural suffering often led to violent protests, but these protests were not actually revolutionary, at least not yet. Louis convened the Estates General in 1789, which had not met since 1614. Representatives for the Third Estate were chosen by provisional elections, but the First and Second Estates, those are more hereditary positions. And the Estates General is supposed to advise the king. Louis expected to be able to dominate the Estates General, but he realized they would be powerless essentially before the First and Second Estates. He realized he wasn't going to make a lot of the critical changes that need to be made. And the Third Estate realized that they would also be powerless before the First and Second Estates. Because here's the thing, everybody has equal voting rights. So the First and the Second Estates, who are pretty much economically equal, can outrank the Third Estate, which again makes up the majority of the population. The Third Estates refused to partake in the Estates General, and they declared themselves to be a national assembly. During the 1700s, the expensive wars drove France into a severe debt, and it inspired the French kings to try to introduce new taxes and fiscal reforms to increase revenue. But these attempts met with resistance in the parliament, and especially the nobility, the Second Estate. Simultaneously, France was at war with the Habsburgs in the Netherlands, and a severe shortage of grain and poor harvests angered the poor even more. And this is where you have that famous saying that never actually happened, let them eat cake. So here we have the clergy, the first, nobility is the second, and then the third, this is actually the bourgeoisie class. Protests turned to revolutions. The king called for a meeting for the Estates Generals to get approval of new taxes, and no. The representatives of the Third Estate, and even some members of the First Estate, declared themselves to be a national assembly. And they pledged to write a constitution that would incorporate the idea of popular sovereignty. And at first, the revolution was limited to men of wealth who either had privilege, the king and the nobles, or wanted privilege, merchants and professionals. Louis decided to compromise with moderate members of the Third Estate. He recognized the National Assembly, and both Louis and the National Assembly attempted to compromise and create a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly created a legislative assembly to draw up a constitution. But here's the problem. The first two estates vowed to not support this. That's where the majority of the wealth is, and Louis really couldn't afford to lose that support. And a couple of reasons why: yes, there is a lot of debt from the wars, there's a poor grain harvest. His wife, Marie Antoinette, again, really never should have been queen, because in addition to her lack of interest in all things government, she had a shopping and a gambling addictions. Um, she would gamble away vast amounts of money, and in addition, there was a rumor that she never wore the same outfit more than 3 times. Marie Antoinette had 500 pairs of shoes. She had a servant whose only job was to take care of those shoes. She would generally change her outfit at least 3 times a day. So you can imagine, if she's not wearing the same outfit more than 3 times, she's going through a lot of clothes. She did have a personal dressmaker. It was a woman she met while she was called the High Princess. It was before she became queen. And at the time, this woman was just a popular dressmaker. Once Marie Antoinette became queen, she hired this woman on retainer, and her only job was to make dresses for Marie Antoinette. Again, kind of shows you how much money Marie Antoinette is burning through very, very, very quickly. Things you don't want when you are the queen. As the economic crisis grew worse, Parisian market women began to assemble, and the king actually prepares to send troops to arrest members of the National Assembly, probably because he's losing support of the first 2 estates. And when this happened, the common people of Paris rose up in arms against the government, and peasant uprisings broke out across the countryside. The people of Paris transformed the revolution into a widespread movement, and Parisians stormed the Bastille. The National Assembly was emboldened to set forth its position in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And as this crisis continues to grow, the Parisian market women make a decision, and they actually march on Versailles, and they capture the king and his family. So this is not well-armed soldiers. These are Parisian market women. So some of them members of the bourgeoisie, but others are shopkeepers. And there are so many of them that they are able to break through the guards and essentially arrest, or at least responsible for the arrest of the king, Marie Antoinette, and their 3 surviving children. Marie Antoinette had a youngest daughter, Sophie Beatrice, who unfortunately died as a child. So surviving are 2 sons and a daughter, Maria Therese, named after Marie Antoinette's mother. The National Assembly, after the arrest of the king and his family, passed a new constitution that limited the power of the monarchy and restructured French politics and society. And when Austria and Prussia, because don't forget Marie Antoinette is actually Austrian, threatened to intervene, the National Assembly declared war in 1791. And the French people responded with a huge display of patriotism, forming volunteer armies and mobilizing resources to meet the threat. All right, so you've probably seen this painting before. The storming of the Bastille. It occurred in Paris, France on the morning of July 14th, 1789. And this is the medieval fortress and prison in Paris known as the Bastille. It represents the royal authority and power in the center of Paris. So, the infamous Reign of Terror. Under pressure from the citizens of Paris, the National Assembly dissolved itself, and the National Convention was created and dominated by a radical party called the Jacobins, or the Jacobins. And the king's attempt to flee in 1792 with his family led to his rearrest and then eventual execution. And it also led to the formation of a new government, again, the National Convention. And the Jacobins are dominated by a radical mountain faction, and their leader is a man, he's very famous, you probably heard of him as Robespierre. One of the most important innovations of this group came in the form of a new calendar. And another very famous man, Jean-Paul Marat, who is best known for his role as a radical journalist and politician during the French Revolution, was known for a couple of things. One, he has a very fiery tone in his writing. He had a very uncompromising stance toward the new leaders and the institutions of the revolution, as well as an advocacy for the basic human rights for the poorest members of society. He was a very radical voice for the French Revolution, but in addition to the mountains, you have the Gredonians, and they're actually kind of opposing the radical faction. So you have this split in the National Convention. The mountain faction has the power, and Gredonians don't, they're being executed. So Jean-Paul Marat is actually executed by a young woman named Charlotte Corday. And in her trial, she says, I killed one man to save the lives of thousands, before she's executed and beheaded on the guillotine. And actually, after she was beheaded, a man from the audience came up, grabbed her head out of a basket, and slapped her in the face. And he was actually arrested for 6 months and put in jail for 6 months because of that. But Jean-Paul Marat sort of became this famous symbol of the Reign of Terror and the leaders of the revolution. And that's a painting up top. He had a skin condition. He would take medicinal baths, and Charlotte Corday came in while he was taking one of these baths, because that's where he spent most of his time. And while he was there, she stabbed him and severed one of the arteries in his chest. Anyway, so after Marat dies, Robespierre continues the rise to power. And he's bringing many radical changes, and he responds to criticisms of the revolution by creating the Committee of Public Safety. And their job was essentially to kill anybody who opposed them. Members of the middle class, especially from outside of Paris, began to reject Robespierre and his reign. And the Reign of Terror actually began to consume people who were in the Ejectment's party. Eventually, we'll talk about that in just a second, though. Executive power is placed in the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, like I said. And under this committee, the militant feminist forces, like those Parisian women who marched and arrested the king and his family, were repressed. New actions against the clergy were approved. Suspected enemies of the revolution were imprisoned and guillotined, quite often without trial, or if the trial was there, it was a farce. However, in July of 1794, conservatives in the National Convention voted for the arrest and execution of Robespierre, and he would actually die on the guillotine, as he had forced many others to. All of this is going to allow the rise of Napoleon. In 1795, the National Convention created a new constitution. After Robespierre's execution, the convention worked to undo the radical reforms of the Robespierre years. They ratified a more conservative constitution and created a new executive authority, the Directory. And the Directory's suspension of the election results of 1797 signaled the end of the Republican phase of the revolution. And it's also, this chaos allowed Napoleon Bonaparte to seize power in 1799 after he staged a coup. He was aided by 2 members of the Directory, and this marked the beginning of another form of government, popular authoritarianism. And Napoleon was quite popular with the French people. Because of this, he was able to improve French nationalism. He promised the people glory, not liberty. Very important distinction. And at first, Napoleon had many military victories that increased French national pride. But his downfall began with his attempt to conquer Russia, the Battle of Borodino. And Napoleon provided greater internal stability and protection of personal and property rights by negotiating an agreement with the Catholic Church, the Concordat of 1801. He also helped to steer forth the Civil Code of 1804, and then he declared himself emperor that same year. And at the same time, the Napoleonic system denied basic political and property rights to women and restricted freedom of speech and expression. The stability of the Napoleonic system depended upon the success of the military and upon French diplomacy. No single European state could defeat Napoleon, but his occupation of the Iberian Peninsula turned into an incredibly costly war of attrition with Spanish and Portuguese resistance forces. And in 1812, his attack on Russia ended in disaster. And this is the infamous Winter in Russia incident. Napoleon's final defeat was caused by a coalition of European powers. An alliance of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and England defeated Napoleon in 1814. And Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The Roman monarchy was restored with Louis XVIII. And noticed we have actually skipped Louis XVII. That would be Louis XVI's son. After his father died, his son was crowned king, but unfortunately his son would die in prison. His son was quite young, I believe, between the ages of 10 and 12 when this occurred. Napoleon was forced to abdicate. Monarchy is restored with Louis XVIII, who would reign for 10 years, 1814 to 1824. And Napoleon's small comeback, defeated again in 1815 at Waterloo, which is in present-day Belgium, he was exiled to a small island where he died eventually. Alone. Bitter. Sad. That being said, let's move on. So here's a map of Napoleon's Europe. So all the territory he's got, you can see the French Empire as well as dependent states. That's pretty much anything in green is where he's able to expand to. People who are allied with Napoleon, they're in Russia, and at war with Napoleon, Portugal, and Great Britain. The Haitian Revolution would actually be inspired because of the French Revolution, and the French colony of Saint Domingue was one of the richest European colonies in the Americas, but its economic success was based on one of the most brutal slave regimes in the Caribbean. The life expectancy of an enslaved person was 7 years. Saint Domingue was dominated by a small white minority. In 1791, a civil war broke out between the white minority and the gens de couleur. There were 3 social classes. You have the Grand Blancs, which basically just means a large plantation owned by a white man. The Petit Blanc, which is a smaller plantation owned by a white man, and the gens de couleur, which are freed African men or women who generally owned small plots of land or were artisans. True revolution broke out with a slave rebellion. Just so you know, women generally did not own large plantations or even small plantations. It was usually just men, and they were also either European men or the offspring of European men. The Slave Revolt was led by a Vundan priest. You've probably heard that word uses voodoo before. And his name was Bauckman. And his slave revolt attacked the planters' estates, but the French army was sent to Saint Domingue to restore order, which they were able to do. However, this political turmoil and happening in France weakened the ability of colonial administrators to maintain order and led to conflict between slaves and gens de couleur on the one hand, and the whites, either Grand Blanc or Grand Petit, on the other. A slave rebellion under the leadership of Francois L'Ouverture took over the colony in 1794. The gens de couleur were free men and women, mostly of mixed race or of African descent, like I said before. By 1801, Toussaint was in control of most of the island, and Napoleon truly opposed the Haitian Revolution. With such power, he's like, no, we have to stop this, basically because this colony was a moneymaker for France. Napoleon's 1802 attempt to reestablish French authority led to the capture of L'Ouverture. Here's the thing. There was actually a deal made that France said, you know what? We realize you deserve independence. Let's talk this out. We will stop the regime of slavery. And L'Ouverture actually goes to talk to them. But unfortunately, during this talk, you would call this an illegal arrest. He is arrested, and unfortunately, he is executed. Which what Napoleon didn't realize was actually the worst thing that he could have ordered, because L'Ouverture's execution really ignited the people fighting for independence. That was pretty much lighting the barrel of gunpowder. And because of this execution, more people rise up. He fails to retake the colony, and they become the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804. The independent Republic of Haiti was established. Slave owners in the Americas were absolutely terrified by the precedent of the Haitian Revolution. However, others were inspired by the Haitian Revolution, especially the people in South America who were still under control of European powers. So as you can see, here we have Saint Domingue, modern-day Haiti. All right, the Congress of Vienna and conservative retrenchment, 1815 to 1820. From 1814 to 1815, representatives of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria met in Vienna to create a comprehensive peace settlement that would reestablish and safeguard much of the old order in Europe. And a man named Clemens von Metternich led this. He was a politician and a statesman of Romanist extraction, and one of the most important diplomats of his era. He served as the Austrian Empire's foreign minister from 1809 and chancellor from 1821 until the liberal revolutions of 1848 forced his resignation. So as you can see, he is a powerful minister and a powerful diplomat for quite a long time. For almost 30 years, he is involved in politics. And again, considering life expectancy, that is no short amount of time. Anyway, Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, led the Congress of Vienna, and he restored the French monarchy. As you guys remember, Louis XVIII took the throne again. He redrew the borders of France and other European states and helped to establish a holy alliance of Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The first goal of the Congress of Vienna was to establish a new balance of power, in which Europe would prevent imperialism from occurring within. Well, let me rephrase that. Imperialism would not happen in Europe. It would happen outside of Europe, as we will study in later chapters with European imperialism in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. But the goal for the Congress of Vienna is to prevent imperialism within Europe's own borders. The other goal, continuation of the first goal, is to maintain the peace between the great powers. And the second goal was to prevent political revolutions, especially like the French Revolution, and basically just maintain the status quo. And maintain the status quo was met with partial success in the short term, but was bound to fail in the long term because it opposed the irresistible forces of historical change resulting from modernization. And what you'll see, these forces take the form of dual revolutions of liberalism and nationalism. The Holy Alliance defeated liberal revolutions in Spain and Italy in 1820, and they tried, without success, to suppress liberal and nationalistic ideas. The Congress of Vienna was convened in 1815 by the four powers. Ultimately, they were able to maintain some peace, but as we'll find out later, borders will change, new countries are born, revolutions will continue. Nationalism, reform, and revolution. Popular support for national self-determination and democratic reform grew throughout Europe. Between 1829 and 1830, Greece gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire. In France, the people of Paris forced the monarchy to accept constitutional rule and to extend voting privileges. In Britain, public opposition to the Corn Laws and anger at the government's treatment of political dissent ultimately led to parliamentary reform and a dramatic expansion of voting rights, at least for men. In Europe, the desire for national self-determination and democratic reform led to a series of revolutions in 1848. And we're back to France. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna again restores the monarchy. Louis Philippe, he is a cousin of Louis XVI, is chosen to be the new king, Louis XVIII. In France, the monarchy is overthrown and replaced by an elected president called Louis Napoleon. Elsewhere in Europe, the revolutions of 1848 failed to gain either their nationalist or Republican objectives. In France, Republicans were not happy with Louis Philippe's reign and rebelled. Louis Napoleon was elected president in 1848, like I said, and in 1852, Louis Napoleon proclaimed himself Napoleon III, Emperor of France. And his reign is known as the Second Empire, which lasted from 1852 to 1870. The period was known for stability, prosperity, and expansion of French power. And Louis Napoleon was forced to abdicate in 1870 when Germany invaded France. In conclusion, both the American and French revolutions were responses to impositions by European monarchs and governments that seemed to break with existing practice or custom. And the American Revolution did produce the most democratic government of its time, albeit one in which slavery remained and full rights were limited to the majority of the people. The French Revolution, before it fell victim to its own extremes, promoted even more democratic and egalitarian ideals. And Haiti's revolution was a powerful blow against slavery. The latter two revolutions occurred in states where elites were more entrenched and inequality is most pronounced. And as a result, these revolutions were ultimately more violent. Conservative retrenchment after Napoleon prevailed in the short term in Europe, but nationalism and liberalism could not be held in check for long, and the new social classes, arising with industrial capitalism, ultimately demanded a new social and political order. New political freedoms were limited to a minority. Women could not partake in the 20th century, and slavery endured until the second half of the 19th century in America. So we're going to stop there for today. This wraps up our revolutions in the Atlantic world. We'll be moving on to the Industrial Revolution. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, have a great day, guys. Cheers.